Our talk this morning is called Cloud Control and Turning Cost into Competitive Advantage. So I'm Brody, Deren. I'm with Trility Consulting. I live here in Omaha. I've been in technology services for effectively my entire career for about 20 years. And Trility Consulting is a integrated AI solution consulting company. So we help mid-market and enterprise-sized companies define, design, and deliver end-to-end technology solutions. And I get the chance to work with a bunch of really smart people, including these two gents here today. I promise you I did put on deodorant and even some smells good, as my kids would call it, and they guys still chose to sit a couple seats away from me. But I'll kick it over to Eric to introduce himself.
Hello, name is Eric Gerling. Actually from the Des Moines area. I've been with Trility since the start. Been doing technology stuff for probably 25-ish years now. Primarily, used to be DevOps, still kind of DevOps, platform engineer, CI/CD, really all things back end. I tend to tell people I don't make pretty pictures, so I do all the stuff behind the scenes that doesn't generally get visualized. So.
And I'm Jay Brummels. I grew up here in Omaha. I am a principal consultant at Trility. I've spent the last 6 years primarily in the financial space doing cloud governance, including security and FinOps practices. And prior to that, was a consultant most of my life as a software architect or principal architect.
Thanks, guys. So these guys are the stars of the show, and I'm going to be trying to put the ball on the tee for them to hit it out of the park. But so we're going to talk about obviously the cloud and turning your, as mentioned in the title, turning your investment in the cloud into a competitive advantage. And the initial promise of the cloud was ultimately speed to market and savings. But for a lot of leaders, the stark realities become out of control, spiraling costs. And so before we dive into solutions for this problem, I want to start zeroing in on the problem. Eric, from your hands-on experience in helping companies modernize, how common is this problem? And what's the first symptom a CIO or CFO usually notices that signals that their cloud investment's kind of spinning out of control?
I think up to this point, pretty much every organization I've had the opportunity to work with has struggled with some cloud costs and cloud management at some level. Typically, get into some of those conversations with the CFO. They seem to be generally the last person it seems like sometimes to hear, to understand that cloud expenses are getting out of hand, or really just IT expenses, right? So it just kind of depends on how budgets work inside of some of those organizations and where some of that stuff is lining up. But what we tend to see a lot of is developers are very, very excited about getting into the cloud. They're very, very excited about getting into new opportunities, new things, new regions, new services. And sometimes it's as simple as just forgetting to turn the lights off when they leave, right? So there's lots of those things that come up. So most, if not every organization we've worked with has had some level of issue with cloud costs and with managing and maintaining some of that. Everybody tries to attack it a little bit differently, but at the end of the day, it's a very common problem from my experience.
How do they? When is that first signaled, right? For a leader, what's kind of the first thing that hits them in the face? Like, you know, when do they discover that? Oftentimes?
Typically it's the bill at the end of the month. So that's usually the time that sometimes that happens. With most of the, depending on your agreements and your conversations with your cloud providers, it's usually an end of month thing, which at that point it's too late, right? Meter's been running, expenses have been, have already been paid out to those services that charge you on that hourly or sometimes even more frequently rate. And at the end of the month, there's a giant bill, and that's sometimes the first indication. Which at that point, frankly, it's too late, right? It's that money's been spent, and now you're in a recovery. Now you're in a, how did this get out of hand? How do we, and then we just start to spin from there.
So that end of month bill shock, that's obviously a real tangible pain point for a lot of people. And it's oftentimes the catalyst that gets leaders looking for answers, but reactive panic's not a strategy. So that brings us to our kind of first takeaway message of the day, which is you should never be surprised by a bill. So Jay, this sounds great in theory, never be surprised by a bill, but what's kind of the first practical step a leader in this room could take to move their organization from being reactive to more proactive in this manner? How do you get ahead of the bill?
Yeah, so, I came on. Hello? How about now? So, the first thing that you need to have is the ability to understand where your costs are being spent. You need to understand how much is being spent and for what purpose. And oftentimes, you might just say, well, let's build a dashboard and we'll just put the cost up there and everybody can be aware of it. But what portion of that cost was allocated to which teams are the important things. So if you have a business that may charge per transaction, you're going to want to understand what are you paying per transaction for each of your systems. And so really starting with tagging and being able to understand and at least show what each department or each app or each project is consuming, and then relate that back to how much that project or that team or that department is gaining. And so then you can have this dashboard that's visible for everybody. And until you have that, making decisions like, oh, let's just go buy a bunch of reservations might be the wrong thing. What if you reserve 3 years of way oversized instances and you find that out later?
So sometimes we're finding, let's work on that mic, see if it works. Thanks. You find spikes, right, and usage spikes, and that comes recognized at the end of the month in this bill. And we have this belief that you should treat a usage spike like you would treat an outage. And that's a powerful mindset shift. And Eric, could you kind of give us a tangible example of what that would look like? Like how do you treat a usage spike like an outage?
So a client that I've worked with here recently got into, so they were long tail development, a lot of resources being expended, and they were kind of starting to see a real big ramp up on a weekly basis with the number of developers and the number of instances and the number of things that were being built out in the cloud. And so we kind of gathered in our war room and just tried to make sure that we had an open dialogue between the development teams, between the project management teams, leadership, and make sure that everybody understood, one, why we were ramping up some of those things, and so that people were aware of it as it was happening. And then two, having that open conversation again with the development teams and with the engineering teams to be able to say, hey, please make sure that you are utilizing this resource. So a lot of times what we have or what we see is somebody spins something up to test or to validate, and then they either forget that it's there or they go home for the end of the night, right? And so much like we would do with outages, right, where we get lots of teams into a war room and we have those active conversations with representatives from those teams, you do the same thing with those financial spikes as well, to make sure that everybody is, one, aware, two, is actively understands that this is something that is important to the organization to manage, and then everybody can be on the same page and understand. So it turns into less of a finger pointing, right? So when something goes down, everybody likes to point the finger sometimes at somebody else and say, no, my stuff's tight, right? You get people in that room and you get people having that conversation, and that tends to lead to solutions much faster. And so just like Brody mentioned, just like we would manage an outage, we manage the financial bumps the same way. Sometimes it's a conversation to say, hey, I need to spend these additional resources because we have this deadline. Management, the organization, leadership can understand that, and they can make that decision to say, yep, we're comfortable with that spend. We understand why that's there, right? But that conversation has happened, and what very, very often ends up happening is that conversation doesn't happen. And so at the end of the month, somebody is like, well, if you would have told me that was going to cost me an extra $50,000 in spend, we would have adjusted our timelines to manage that better, right? But since that conversation didn't happen, everybody spent that money or that money's already been spent. And so again, like we talked earlier, we get to the end of the month and the bill is there.
So we've established that monitoring's critical, right? And but even that can kind of feel like a defensive posture. So this brings us to our second takeaway, and perhaps the most important key message of this morning, which is the real payoff comes from creating a culture of fiduciary responsibility amongst your engineering teams. So Eric, this idea has to be a C-suite priority, not just an engineering problem, right? So how have you seen, or how does the company begin to build this fiduciary responsibility culture? Like what specific role does the executive team play? And making this, not just a finance department mandate, but an engineering ownership.
I think it's an awareness thing, right? So a lot of it starts with awareness. So there are, depending on the size of the organization, depending on the number of people, sometimes developers are just not aware, right? They're given a sandbox, and they say, go play in the sandbox, right? And there's not a connection sometimes between the sandbox is fun technology, but the sandbox isn't necessarily something that I'm financially responsible for, or that I understand the costs that are going into that, right? I relate that a lot to, I've got teenage sons, and we, like any parent, we have the conversation about what stuff costs, and they're like, yeah, cool, Dad. And then they're off doing whatever, right? So as an example, we pay for gas. Guess whose kid drives all the other kids around? Because we pay for gas, right? So the same situation tends to happen a lot in organizations, that if you're not at least bringing awareness and then tracking that awareness and making that an active conversation, sometimes that can just sort of get lost in the noise, and it's very easy to disconnect the financial costs with the excitement of a new, new service, new technology. AI is a big one. So anybody that's had to pay for AI credits knows those things are gone, in a heartbeat. And if you're not really aware of what it is that you're doing, you can get yourself into some financial problems pretty quickly, not really understanding that that's a situation you've created. So the first and foremost is just having open and honest and transparent conversations about it, right? What we've seen in a lot of organizations, the financial piece sits over here, and anytime the CFO gets on the call, everybody starts getting worried about their jobs, right? So building relationships so that it's not just a job conversation, but it's a, hey, we as an organization, people solve problems, technology doesn't. So this isn't about jobs, this is about making sure that we are responsible with our money so that we can continue to pay you to solve problems for us, right? So it's building those relationships from an executive level down into the engineering, into the project management teams actively.
Can I add on just a little bit? Some strategies that might work for you could be to turn it into a game and celebrate big wins. If there's a team that cut out, $100,000 worth of operating costs, celebrate that like you just made a huge sale. And those celebrations and those games help other teams want to participate and want, to wear that as a badge of honor. I saved the company this. And it all comes really from having that information right at the fingertips of anybody who needs to see it.
So let's zero in on that part a little bit, and really focus on developers, right? So our message is that you win when you have developers thinking, is there a more cost-efficient way to do this? So Jay, from your perspective, like as an architect, how do you empower a developer to think like this without slowing them down, right? Without stifling innovation? Like, what information do they actually need at their fingertips?
Well, oftentimes it's the developer that knows of the new, cheaper way to do something, and it's the architect that is stuck in the past. And unfortunately, that's just the way it is. So sometimes it's good to get your developer's voice to speak up and say things like, hey, this might be a new low-cost alternative that could accomplish the same thing. Now, questions of security and things like that might come into play, but spend a little more time having conversations and letting those ideas come from the bottom up, and sometimes that'll help save cost or move you into a model where you're using more PaaS services and saving costs on infrastructure maintenance and things like that as well. Other things you can do is I believe these dashboards that can be created in any of the clouds can show great visuals to an executive level, but they can also be down to a team level. What's your team's development performance this week? What's your development environment costing? Can we cost less than the other teams? Can we remember to turn it off or automate turning off our dev instances when we're not using them? If we're going on vacation, can we not turn them on? Things like that.
So that's a great point in terms of how to get the right information to the right people. And that's a perfect lead into one of our other points. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah. Just to add something onto that as well, and we talk about this in the technology space quite a bit, right? So when we talk about silos, right? So I've got my DevOps team and they're responsible for this, and I've got my developers and they're responsible for this, and the project management team is responsible for the next thing, right? Not every person is interested in understanding all the things that go on, but transparency between teams can generate a lot of the things that Jay is talking about, right? So as a developer, sometimes you have developers that are just super nerds and they want to learn about all the stuff that's in the full stack, and they're a great resource sometimes to be able to find those cost savings and find those opportunities within the DevOps. So it's making sure that each of the teams understand that they are open, they're transparent, code is available for review, right? We certainly like to promote both from the top all the way to the bottom of a merge request or a pull request based culture where that code is available. That does not mean that everybody's going to go look through the stuff that builds out the infrastructure, that puts those servers in place or builds that software. But you'll be surprised. There are quite a few individuals that will, when they've got some free time on their hands and they're waiting for something to be completed or they're looking at something, they'll go look at, hey, how does that server actually run, or how do we build out that infrastructure? And finding those individuals and really kind of getting their insights cross team can be extremely valuable when it comes to managing that financial burden to some of the things that Jay just mentioned.
So you mentioned transparency as a key there. So like one of our key messages again is being transparent with cloud costs to all those people that need to have a hand in it. Because you can't have a culture of responsibility if the cloud costs are in a black box. So building on that, Eric, thinking about, we talk about it at Trility, showback and chargeback methods, right? So if you can, for the leaders in this room, sort of define, at a high level what those concepts are, chargeback versus showback, and what's the difference, and when one might fit better than another in a certain instance.
Yep. So in a chargeback situation, right, that's all of the bits and pieces of your organization, accounting wise, are broken out to where somebody's actually getting charged. They have a budget, they're responsible for that budget, and then they're actually getting charged for those particular resources that they're using. And then showback would be somebody shows up at the end of the month and says, here's the bill for your services. I'm not going to charge you, but I'm at least going to show you, right? So showback is really just showing, hey, this is what IT costs, this is what DevOps costs, this is what our cloud costs were, and then chargeback is actually charging for those individual resources. A lot of that comes down to how your organization is set up and what's going to work best. It also comes back to some of the culture, right? So if it's again, it's me and my teenage sons, showback doesn't work real well because they really don't care, right? I show them at the end of the month, like, hey man, this is what I spent on gas for you, and they're like, cool, all right, like, hey, let's back it down, right? But chargeback isn't really necessarily going to work in that case either because they're full-time students and they're participating in sports and all those other things. So there's finding that balance and making sure that there's that understanding, and a lot of that just comes from dialogue. So again, it's very organization dependent and kind of how things are set up. I don't think switching an organization from showback to chargeback or going the other direction is going to solve a lot of problems. But it again really comes back to that dialogue and making sure that we understand what those numbers mean, how those things are put together, and how we manage that, financially.
And I think we'd be remiss to say that it's really easy to do showback, and then all you have to do is start charging them or budgeting them, right? But one of the things that is common in most enterprises is you have shared services. So how do you allocate those costs? Again, this could be unique per company, but you do have to look at the models that you're using for a shared service. So something like storage, can you figure out in that storage how much is used per each of these projects and just allocate the percent accordingly? It doesn't have to be perfect, but the teams will understand. And then even those shared things can start being split across the different teams' budgets that are out there, and they can see their show back or be charged accordingly.
So let's make this real for a moment, right? A leader might be thinking here in this room, like, so my teams are shared, I've got complex systems, this concept seems kind of impossible, right? So what's a day one, Jay, strategy for sort of implementing show back? How do you start tagging and allocating costs when you already have a mature environment?
Yeah, I think day one, you could say today, hey, if we don't have 80% of our assets tagged, let's start there. By the end of the quarter, 80% of the tags of our assets in the cloud need to be tagged. And that could be with cost center or purpose, but pick 3 or 4 basic tags. And then that gives you the ability at a high level to say, what purpose am I spending this money for? What environment maybe could be part of that? If my QA environment costs more than my prod environment, what's going on there? And it lets you ask those type of questions. And then cost center or department maybe to help you understand which department is using or allocating those. The other 20% might be those shared things, and then that's where it takes more humans to figure out, well, what percent, and you don't get that easy number from the cloud like you would get just from tagging those assets. Start there, then build dashboards, right? So now it's like, hey, I know that my product takes in this amount, it's a fixed cost yearly, and we have this many subscribers, but we're spending, 90% of that. Make it a game. How do we cut back operationally so that we're charging more? Or do we have to talk, it's time to adjust cost? We've implemented these new features and we've been at the same price point for so long.
So as I say, something else, and we don't talk about it very often, but a lost art is resource allocation, right? So if we all go back in the day, right, when I had to go buy a physical server or I had to buy a rack of servers or whatever it is, resource allocation and those conversations were something that happened on a very regular basis, right? So it's day one or day two can be starting those conversations as well. It's like, all right, what do we actually think we need for these resources? What are the things that we think we actually need to stand these up and manage these things? How do we appropriately allocate those resources and sort of bring back the resource allocation conversations that we used to have all the time that we kind of got out of the habits of doing because it's just, I guess it's an API call away, and I can get a GPU-based server, or I can get a server with 64 gigs of RAM, right? So it's a simple API call now. Back in the day, that wasn't the case, right? We had to have conversations. We had to have that budgeting conversation. So it's bringing those things back as well in terms of resource allocation and having those conversations.
So we've been involved with the public cloud. These guys have been involved with the public cloud for many, many years. And Trility was born in the cloud. We believe in the benefits of the cloud. We've spent a lot of time so far talking about the stop wasting money part of the title of our talk. So we're going to pivot to the start accelerating delivery portion of this. And one of the messages that I think is critical for innovation is efficient local development is one of the most important and overlooked pieces of this puzzle. So, Jay, you've seen this. Organizations buy these, powerful, expensive laptops that can become sort of fancy text editors at the end of the day when their CI/CD pipelines are really used as a slow bottleneck in development environment, right? So from a business leader's perspective, what's the real world cost of that inefficiency and how does it impact speed to market?
Yeah, so we need to think about developers, developer count, developer salary over time, and how much cycles could be wasted if you do not allow them, for security reasons, to run things on their sweet MacBook Pro or whatever it is you're buying these days, right? And so then the question is, if there's a security reason to make things happen in a pipeline, now I know it's not distributed out on my computers, make the SLA of your build system be 2 minutes or less, or that's a prod outage, right? Now your developers are not wasting 2 or 3 of their, let me try this and see if it works cycles, and then they're waiting 12 to 15 minutes and losing context. between every iteration. Now they get almost instant feedback, and they get 2 or 3 more iterations a day. If you're taking those away from them, and they could have done it locally faster, well, how much money are you losing at the end of the year? It could be, in the 4 and 5 digits, or even more if you have a lot of developers. The alternative side is, why spend only cloud resources doing all these builds and tests when you can force some of that to happen on laptops? So you buy these nice laptops, don't let commits go unless they're already set up to run tests locally. And so then you skip a lot of the things that the pipeline's doing for you. And yes, it should still be done, but now the pipeline's only doing it before you're ready to release to an environment, not to gate every code commit, right? And so you start saving costs on that end and using the CPU and memory that you're giving every developer in hand.
We've seen this, Eric, if this problem sort of over-reliance on the cloud for basic development, then what's the solution? Or like, what's the golden path for a developer that, what's that look like that empowers them to build and test locally? And what's the business need to invest in to make that happen? Is it tooling, platforms, training, like to make that a reality?
Actually, a lot of it actually starts with, I think, with project management and with leadership, right? So it's a willingness to understand that we want to take advantage and we want to use those resources that we hand every developer effectively. It's very easy to use your CI/CD pipelines as a development environment, right? I don't have to worry about API calls because I can do that stuff in my development environment. I can build that out there, and that over time it's a faster way to get to where you need. It's evaluating those things on a regular basis to say, okay, can I bring that back local? Can I do these things local, right? Jay mentioned security testing. Security testing and validation is extremely important. You can't necessarily do that every time on a laptop, right? So if you're running Coverity or you're running Nexus or something like that, a lot of that stuff really kind of has to happen in that shared space. You're not gonna be able to do that locally. So what can I do locally? What are the tools that are available to me locally that I can at least get a validation or a check before on a pre-commit before I push it up to get a level of comfort, a level of confidence that when I actually get it into the proper security scanning, it's going to pass. There are a number of tools now that are available for those types of things, and so it's just continuing to explore and prioritize dev local and making sure that is something that everybody in the organization is considering when they're looking at the work that's to be done, and just making sure that you take advantage of that. If your developers, to Jay's point, right, if they're sending a commit and then it's 20 minutes before they get proper feedback back on that commit, that's a problem. Like that's a huge problem. One, the financial cost in the cloud of doing that. Two, the financial cost of that developer potentially sitting idle, waiting for the feedback for that change. And so it is well worth the investment of making sure that you break that down and find those ways to do those things locally. Whether it's in an AWS space, you're utilizing local stack, right, which is a containerized environment to be able to do some testing and validation against, or you're using containers. We've talked about containers for probably a decade or more now, right? So it's continuing to evolve those technologies, but putting the priority on dev local will help you maximize, one, the spend on the hardware you've given your developers, and two, making sure that you're having that conversation actively of like, all right, we're doing this in the cloud, do we need to do this in the cloud? The answer is sometimes yes, again, security tooling, and then making sure that when it's there, that everybody understands that needs to be efficient.
Just one more thing. I have worked for some financial institutions where by mandate they're not allowed to have any of that code even come down to a laptop, and so they have these virtual build environments, Coder or Google Desktop, or excuse me, GitHub Desktop, and that's fine. But then consider, why does a developer now need 64 gigs of RAM and a Pentium if all they're doing is launching a web browser? Give them an iPad and a sweet keyboard, and it should be fine, right?
So, kind of amalgamating some of these ideas together, Eric, I'm going to throw this one to you. Matter of fact, on the client you're currently serving, We have ultimately provided some cloud cost control solutions that on an annualized basis resulted in about 780 grand worth of savings, right, for them. And this is a mid-market sized company, and that's really impactful dollars in that case. So as we kind of look at some of these points that we've talked about here, how did we get to this, solution path for these folks, if you want to kind of describe, it to result in $750,000 a year in annualized savings?
So a lot of it is kind of play the 2-year-old in the room, right? You have to ask why. And so the fun part of being a consultant is you get to go in and you get to be a 2-year-old and just why? Why are we doing this? Why is this happening? Why are we doing this? And you get to have some great conversations with people, and very quickly you find out somebody will go, oh, I don't remember why we did that. I'm like, cool, let's dump it, let's get rid of it, or let's dive in and really understand what that's there for, right? In the case of the current client, there were a number of accounts that existed that had resources running in them that nobody really had an understanding of why it was there, what those things were serving. So we didn't just destroy everything. It was we power it down. Look for traffic rates, make sure that doesn't appear to be used, power it down, give it that period of time or that grace period to say, oh, it doesn't look like it's there, make sure things are backed up, and then destroy it, right? Going through and removing most of that stuff that had been built up and that people just honestly forgot existed or didn't really understand was still a thing. And then the next thing was working with the development teams. The development teams were sort of given that sandbox. And they were said, all right, go play, go build, go do, and then having a conversation in this case about dev local. Why are we, connecting into this container and doing some of this testing in an environment that is very expensive when we have a system that allows you to do that locally? And so encouraging those developers to do those allowed us to really cut a lot of the development environments out of the cloud where they really didn't need to be, and so those savings added up very, very quickly over that annualized period.
I know that was unique to your instance, but there's also considering the duration of keeping logs. This is a huge one. I've seen companies grow to millions of dollars over 5 years of 5-year-old logs. Why have them that long? So there are purposes for keeping logs around. There is legislation that says you have to keep things around for a certain amount of time, but there's also different stages of storage for those logs in the cloud. Some things are like instantly queryable, I need them right now. Those tend to be the more expensive. Maybe you only need 60 days of that information or 180 to make a good decision. And then it starts to become, after a year, we need to get it fast but not that fast. After 2 years, let's put that stuff on cold storage, and if it takes 3 days to pull it up for an audit, that's okay. And then you start to see a lot of savings come in, and at some point, it's okay to delete stuff. And then the other thing is, those same logs could be shipped to 4 or 5 different systems. Only one needs to be your permanent system of record, right? So if your security team's using Splunk and another team's using, Datadog, do you need all the logs in all the places, or can we pick, hey, the security ones are really what the mandate's talking about. We'll keep them in Splunk for the duration, and everything else can cut them back after 60 days.
Well, we're approaching time here, and this has been a great discussion, guys. We've covered a lot of ground, obviously, with points of emphasis of treating cost spikes like outages, right? Building a culture of fiscal responsibility and empowering your developers to move faster. So I guess as a final takeaway for any leader in this room, if they could only do one thing next week to start on this journey of transforming their cloud costs to a competitive advantage and a strategic accelerator, what do you think is the most single impactful action they could take? That's a question for either of you or both of you.
I think, especially at a leadership level, I think the first question is to go ask, can I see the AWS bill or the Azure bill? Can I see it every day? I don't need a dashboard. Don't need anything fancy. Use the existing tools and the existing structures that are in place. I want to start to see the trends, right? And start to build an understanding of what some of those things are. Start to understand where some of those dollars are being spent. The cloud providers provide wonderful tools, really for free for the most part, that provide you with a great amount of insight at a very high level that will help you get an understanding of what we're actually spending money on. And if you haven't done that, like if you're waiting for the monthly report, and you're stunned by that monthly report, those tools are available every day. So it's taking an active role and spending 15 minutes in the morning and just saying, all right, what happened yesterday? What happened yesterday? And starting to build that awareness, and then start to have those conversations with your teams on why did this happen, or why are we doing this? Not from an accusatory, but just help me understand. Help me understand why we're doing these things, and are there ways to improve that?
All right, we are going to take Q&A, and you guys want to come collect a mic or two. Any questions in the room about any of the topics that we have covered here today?
You will have to say your questions into a mic for the video.
Please raise your hands very high so we can see.
Question regarding what are some strategies you've seen for kind of upfront estimation and modeling of workloads, like before the development has even started, especially as it comes to like you mentioned, like shared resources or things that might be volume or transaction based?
Just like with anything in life, sometimes there's more than one way to accomplish your goal. And gamifying it or turning it into a competition and maybe sending two teams to do a POC a different way, and then taking the cost, the spend of maintenance and the spend, daily into consideration, as well as the performance, right? Oftentimes it's always, we need the most throughput. Well, you can have that. You just turn the dial on the cost, but at some point we need to even it out. And so having a slight, just fun competitions or hackathons or something like that for the next innovative idea, to see not only who can run it with the required throughput, but at the optimal cost, is an idea.
I was going to say, from a developer perspective, right, it's encouraging the performance conversation. That's another skill that seems to have kind of gone away. So like resource allocation and understanding what resources are, performance management has kind of gone away a little bit, right? So it's bringing that back to the forefront of, hey, I want to use this new programming language. Neat. Can you share some performance statistics? Can you share some, and to his point, just having either bake-offs or having an active conversation about performance, that helps a lot too, right? So making sure we understand at a simple level, this is the type of request level that we can see for this amount of resource. That helps with some of that conversation. Again, it's one of those things that when I can just go get a server with 64 gigs of RAM and 7 CPUs or 8 CPUs or whatever it is, people tend to forget that those things do cost money still, right? So it's just actively having that conversation.
I'm going to build up Chris's question, because I think about estimating, Jay. I know when we talked about eventing with the last project, you took some SLAs, and then you took some assumptions, then you kind of built out hey, as the system grows, this is your potential cost. This is if you go this tool. So you kind of did a bake-off without baking anything. I think that might be, if you want to talk through that process in terms of estimation, I think that'd be helpful.
Yeah, so without giving too much away, there was a desire to use an eventing system of Confluent Kafka. And Kubernetes was in place already, and they thought, let's run Confluent because we can get this optimal performance. And I started asking the questions, like, why do you need the Ferrari of throughput, right? What are you going to send through it? And come to find out, it was very minimal amount of use initially. Would you rather see what something might look like that can grow as you grow? And maybe eventually you'll get there. And so it took a little bit of back and forth, because again, the architect was very determined that this is the best way to do things. Yeah, you're right, it is. It's the Ferrari, but it's not just the Ferrari, it's like the Indy 500 version of it, where you need like a whole team to change your tires and oil while you're driving, right? And so use that analogy really with them and said, we can do this with the Volkswagen right now, and your cost will be a third. And it'll do the throughput that you need for the use cases that you know about today. And you can double that 10 times before you're even at what you would spend running this Ferrari today and double the throughput as well as the cost. And then you're at Ferrari level, and at that point, you guys are awesome at this technology. You understand if it's the right thing for you to do, and you don't have to, when you back out, have this huge contract with Confluent that's 3 or 4 years, right, to save that money. So having those discussions and looking at past services like Azure Event Hub in this case, that could do that with the premium edition and zone redundancy and everything that they needed for that cheaper model that will grow.
We can take one more question if there are any. Well, seeing there's no further questions, we appreciate your time. Thank you. I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference.